Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you?
I am fine. How are you doing this afternoon?
I, I'm doing very well. It's a very, very warm day here. Now, it came down out of the 90s Fahrenheit. Now it's down to 88. But
Yay!
yeah, it's rather a warm day.
It
We'd like
is.
to thank you for joining us. If you're new, thank you for finding us. If you are returning, thanks for coming back. You will find in the description everything Paranormalist podcast related from our Facebook groups, links to Patty's blog, Patty's books on Amazon, buy me a coffee. Again, no obligation, but that's there just in case you feel like rewarding us for some of the work we put in. And again, I don't want to make that sound like an advertisement. You know, it's just there. And our email address, paranormalist@theparanormalistpodcast.com. So ideas, comments, feedback that you don't wish to put through some other type of format, you can do it in a more a one-on-one situation like that. And with that, I think I've said my piece. And what is our topic for today?
Well, vampires.
Aha. I wondered when we would be getting to these.
So here we are. So I've always had a fascination with vampires. I've had a couple friends who tell me they had an interaction with one over the course of their lifetimes. A couple friends of mine, different
Okay.
interactions.
All
So
right. Mhm.
I'm a little more convinced they're real than maybe your average bear, and that's basically because I know both these particular people to be pretty honorable and upstanding. I've never heard them embellish in any significant way. And they tell the same story the same way for 20 some years because I tend to have friends for long periods of time. So anyhow, I wanted to talk a little bit about vampires. I'm fascinated with the lore, obviously. A lot of people are because there's a lot of movies and books on the topic. But vampires, the very first known reference to an undead bloodsucker actually shows up in an old Russian text. And it was over a millennium ago. So that's a long time ago.
Sure. Mhm.
It's related to, very many things. There's a sexual component to vampires. There's a demonic component. There's an association with diseases, the unknown, all of that. The name vampire comes from Vet Allah, which is an 11th century word that was used in Russian culture. And that is where we get the root for the word vampire. And it actually is like parts of 3 different nationalities using the same word, and they somehow got put together to become vampire or vampire over the years. I just thought, obviously long before books like Dracula and stuff happened, there were a lot of other stories. So I wanted to go back and find some of them. And then I'm going to bring us back to the day, like modern times, the last few years.
Okay.
So if you go to Eastern Europe, they're called Strigoi. The Strigoi. And that means the one who screams. It's an evil spirit that comes at night to torture people and call them out by calling their names. And if you hear the Strigoi call for you, then you have to be frightened. You're terrified because that means they've targeted you and they're going to come and they're going to take your blood. The Strigoi feed off the blood of humans. One of the things I found interesting, and I didn't know this, is that they can come for an animal or they can come in a human form or an animal form. So they can come remember in Dracula, they start out as the wolves running to the castle.
It's been a while since I read any Bram Stoker, so I have to say that I'll take your word for it. Yeah.
Okay, so there's this, and then whenever he gets off the ship, whenever they get to England, a wolf dashes off the ship, and people wondered how it was hidden in the ship, and they intimate that is Dracula. So anyhow, and I did not know this, but the Strigoi are only given one night of complete freedom. So we think Halloween and vampires and werewolves and all of this. It's not Halloween. I was fascinated.
Oh,
It
okay.
is actually St. Andrew's night, which is November the 30th. And on that night, the Strigoi are completely free for the entire night to have havoc.
All right, then. I know what night I'm staying home with doors locked. Yeah.
And yep, me too.
Hmm.
I just thought it was, always thought it was Halloween. Everybody talks about Halloween and it's what
Uh-huh.
we think culturally, but it's not. It's actually a holy night. It's St. Andrew's night.
Hmm.
I found people who've talked about, this woman, I was reading her, she wrote a little bit about being Romanian, about growing up in the United States with a Romanian culture, though, like her grandmother and great grandmother
Hmm.
came over and, and what have you. And she said, my great grandmother told my mother that she had heard the Strigoi calling out her name. She said, it's very important to remain silent, otherwise bad things will happen to you. They have the power to cause health issues. And if you respond to them, to make you ill, if you respond to them. She says, my mom was a child when the whole community became concerned about the Strigoi in the village. The priest went to the cemetery to kill the vampire because people were coming up ill. The man in the village had died. He was a sinner, or so we were told. His family, I'm thinking everybody's a sinner. I mean, if you're
Hmm.
following any Christian faith, that's pretty much the idea of it. His family started to experience weird stuff. They heard him calling out their names. Soon, other people in the family fell ill. They decided that this relative of theirs had become a Strigoi. And my mother remembers them going to the cemetery. They used a wooden stake and killed this creature. She remembers that there were noises from the grave. My great grandmother was there too. They said the man looked like he was sleeping, even though he had been dead 6 months. And she's describing all of this in Eastern Europe. And there's another account that comes up and it says this woman's telling a story about something that had happened to her. And this is a more modern story. This story we're talking about took place in the 1990s, late 1990s. So this
Wow.
woman is she was living in Europe, and she says she was at a party with some friends, and middle of the winter, it's cold out and what have you, and she didn't really want to walk home. She had walked to the party, but she didn't want to walk home because it got bitter cold and was snowing heavy. And so she had asked somebody she met at the party if they were headed in her direction. And she said, if you don't mind, could I ride with you? Which, I have to tell people, I know today we would never do that because we don't trust anybody. But back in the 80s and 90s and back in the 60s, people got in people's cars, strangers' cars all the time. And it wasn't even thought about. So she asked this guy, and she said, he said, sure, I'll take you home. And so she saw him go outside. She thought he was going to go get to the car. So she followed him out thinking, I don't want him to forget about me. It's bitter cold. I don't want to have to walk the whole way home. And she said, I saw him turn around. He saw a man coming past him. He turned around as if he knew the guy and walked back into the building. So she walked back into the house thinking, I'm not going to stand out here in the cold. Maybe he knew this guy and he's going to chat for a while. And she said she describes the man as medium build with brown hair. He was slim. His clothes were loose. He was common looking, but something about him took my attention. This man who had just come in, he gave me the strongest feeling. I can't describe it well. He looked at me. His eyes were dark brown and glassy. He didn't say anything, and he began to move around the room. There were two people behind him, the man that was going to give her a ride and another man. They seemed to be following him, but she said, I noticed that nobody noticed this man. Like the people he walked up to never turned to talk to him. It was as though he and I were the only two people in the room. I could see him, but nobody else seemed to be able to, except possibly the other two men who were following him, but they never spoke to him. They just stayed 4 paces behind.
Hmm.
And they never walked off or anything. She said, and then I began to notice his movements. His movements seemed to change, as though he were moving backwards somehow. His movements became awkward, unnatural, weird. He was moving backwards, walking backwards. His arms were behind his body, when he moved instead of in the front. I can tell you that it was not fear I felt. You know, not like ghosts and demons and things like that. I was completely numb. I was like my brain had been rewired. I don't know how else to explain it. It was like if you see something happen and it's so strange you can't believe it's real. And you're just standing there in awe, trying to make sense of it. She says that she had one time seen somebody jump off of a set of stairs and commit suicide. And she said it was that same feeling I had then. Like I was watching this person tumble through space knowing they were going to die, and it just didn't seem real. And it was that same sense of disconnect. And she likens it to that. And then she says, he just stood there for a long time, and then I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything. I could barely breathe. And then I remember my mouth opening about halfway because I was struggling to breathe. His eyes were wide and he was fixed on me. I knew I shouldn't make eye contact. I knew it. Subconsciously, I told myself, don't look, no matter what, don't look. He never spoke a word to anybody. He never talked to them, waved at them. He went straight to the door, turned and looked at me. And as he stood at the entrance to the door, he turned his head and looked one last time. He was pale white, and it gave her that same feeling of being, in a spaceless place. And then he left. She said, I tried to gather myself together. I tried to figure out what was wrong. And she said, and I got outside. I decided I'm not going to ride with this guy. He seemed somehow associated. So she and a couple friends started to walk home. And it's freezing cold. She's walking through the snow. She said, I suddenly felt sleepy and tired. And as I got close to my apartment, here he was standing beside this travel agency right by the glass window where it was lit. And I could see him ahead of me. I don't know how he got there ahead of me. I couldn't say he followed me because he was already there when I got there. She said, I switched sides of the sidewalk because I would have had to have walked right past him. My friends seemed to fade away. I don't know what happened to them, but it felt like I was alone with him. And she said, I noticed him watching me. He was smiling. I couldn't see much of his face because of the snow in the distance, but his mouth was deep red, almost like lipstick or blood. I picked up my pace, worrying he might follow, but he just stood there, and he grinned at me. All I can tell you is I'm sure he was not human. I know he was not human. I sensed it the moment I saw him. I locked myself in the apartment, and I refused to go to sleep until daylight. I thought he was going to come for me. Whatever this thing was, it moved faster than me. It knew where I lived because it literally was stationed just outside my home. I'm convinced I met a vampire.
And that's got to be a terrifying feeling. I mean, imagine somebody telling you all the things that they know about you, and then just showing up outside of where you lived. I mean, you got to live in constant fear the rest of your life, probably, just waiting for that to happen.
Yeah, I would think so. Yes, absolutely. I was just fascinated with her story. I came across several others. There was a story about a young man who's telling a story about he had gone skiing as like a week's vacation, decided to go skiing out in the West, and he's at the ski resort, and he's really there just to party and have fun and maybe hook up with some chicks or something like that. This was the like 2000, around 2000, and he's like, there was this girl that came in the first night. He said she wasn't beautiful. She was short. She was well built. And he said she wasn't pretty, but she was sexy. I don't know how else to explain it, he says, but she's really sexy. Like you felt that the moment you saw her. And she had a man with her. And the man seemed to be almost settling her, like he was her servant or something. And the two of them went out to the front desk. The man seemed to be negotiating about a room for the night or for, whatever. He noticed her. He kept watching her because something about her just captivated him. And he's like, and I could tell you she wasn't my type. It wasn't like, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the girl I'm going to marry. He's like, I just couldn't take my eyes off her. And when she comes back into the bar where he's sitting watching her, she focuses directly on him. and other men are watching her, but like she zeroes right on him. And over the next, she ends up staying for like a week, whole week he's there. And over the next couple of days, he's like, I see her at breakfast and she's asked if she can sit with me. And I said, sure. And like, he's like, what's the harm? Even if I have a fling with her, what's the harm? I'm single. I'm over 21. This is my business. And he said on the fourth or fifth night they were sitting in a living room area, downstairs. And he said, I touched her for the first time. I leaned up against her. You could tell she wanted me to do it. She was like leaning into him and the whole 9 yards. And he said, all of a sudden, the second he touched her, he said, I felt this numbness come over me, like I couldn't move anymore. And she grinned as if she knew she had me. And he said, all of a sudden, I'm struggling, trying to figure out a way to move, a way to say anything. And I'm like, I can't move. He's like, and I want you to understand, this wasn't dopamine. This wasn't endorphins. This was not natural. I couldn't move. It was like I was touching dry ice, whether it was through her clothes or, on her arm. It was just that cold. And I was paralyzed by all of it. And he said, I remember when I got up, she reached out her hand and she touched me and she said, should I follow you? And he said, as soon as she touched me, it was like an allergic reaction. I panicked and I said, oh, F no. And I took off. And he said, it's the craziest thing. I can't explain it, but I knew she wasn't human. Whatever she was coming in for the kill.
Wow.
And he talks about it at the very beginning. He says it, and he says it again at the end. He says, I'm not a person who believes in Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, or any of that crap. I would have told you none of this was even possible, except it actually happened to me. And then he tells this story that I just told you. It's quite a tale.
Yes.
It is.
Yeah.
So the next one is about a guy named Lewis. So Lewis, the story takes place in 2011. So we're getting into, modern times. He said he was a political activist in the United States. He doesn't want to tell the town he was in, but it was a city, a great big city in the United States, and there was a lot of political activism going on. I actually think it might have been the what's that Wall Street movement, that they did in the early 2000s. They had that big sit-in for like 4 or 5 months.
The name eludes me. I know what
you know what I'm
referring
talking
to.
about?
I do. Yeah.
Because there's little details he gives me that make me think that it was that movement. Because he says, we were occupying the city block for over 4 months. There's not a lot of protests that Occupy Wall Street. That's what it was called. Mm-hmm. And they were there for months and months, remember?
Yeah, 59 days. Yeah, just did a quick look up on it. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were there. So he's talking about from beginning to end. He was one of the people organizing it, and he was there for 4 months. But he lived in this city, whatever the city was, he lived in it because he would go home and get showers. Other people that were in part of this Occupy movement or whatever this movement was would ask him, could I go to your house and get a shower? Because that's a long time to not shower.
In the city, yes.
Yeah. Well, anywhere, yes. I live in the woods and I promise you, I'm not going 59 days.
If you live in a cabin on the top of a mountain someplace, that may be, once a season. Yeah.
Well, if I have water to drink, I'm going to wash up. I promise everybody. But anyway, So he says he goes home for a week, like about a third of the way through this movement. And, he goes home for a couple days to kind of get cleaned up, take care of things at the house, kind of a deal. And then he would go back. He had a tent there at the movement that he was living in. And he said, when he got back from this, going home for a couple of days, he said there was a guy now living there in the movement in one of the tents. And he said, I was really surprised because he had already had a bunch of people showing admiration and respect for him. And he's like, it wasn't anything that he had done. They just seemed to have a instinctual respect for him. And he's described this man as, he said he was tall and blonde, long hair, a bit of a hippie, with a profound, that was the word he used, profound voice that implied self-confidence. He's like, he had just a really strange aura. And he said, I thought he was a cool dude. you know, so I started talking to him, and he said over the course of time, we had a great conversation. And he said, we talked about it like a magic and UFOs and, you know, just paranormal stuff.
Mhm.
And he said, after several days of talking to this guy brought up the subject of vampires. And he said, I really wasn't very familiar. I mean, he knew, you know, he knew the movies and all that stuff, but he didn't have any great in-depth knowledge on vampires. And he said, the guy told me, he said that vampires are actually regular people, that sometimes, how did he put it? He said that we are regular people who have learned how to manage our life force.
Huh.
And that we are misunderstood. And he said that there are vampire groups, small ones, that they preserve the rituals. And he said there's no blood sucking. At least not now. And he said the blood was really just acknowledging your life force. He said we can suck your life force out, but it's more important that you know how to use your own life force so you can manage it yourself. And he said, I thought it was a weird conversation. I passed it off. I, you know, had a lot of other stuff on my mind because I'm working this movement. And he said, we just stayed friends. And he said, one day the guy asked me if he could go to my house and get a shower. No big problem. I'd let lots of other people do it. No problem. So he said he went over and he got a shower, and when he came back to the movement, he said he came over and thanked me, and he started talking about vampires again. And he said, he started to explain to me how you control your life force inside of your dreams, and how this affects your actual material body. And he said, as he's explaining this to me, I see his jaw making this strange little popping motion. And he has a mask on for some reason. I don't know why, but he says that when he came up to me, he had like a half mask on, and he said, I saw his jaw popping. And he said, he raised the mask, the guy, and he said he had fangs coming out of his mouth. And he said it was like he had these huge canine teeth. And he said he pulled the mask back down, and I didn't react. I just remained very calm. I said, I got to go. And he said, don't you want to know if these are for sucking the blood from people? And he said it worked out that they weren't, that they were an antenna to capture the different vibrations. And he said, I'm telling you, this guy didn't pull anything down. He didn't have his hands to his face. These did not look fake in any way. And it was just like they were popping out, and you could just see the muscles reacting to moving as these things came down out of him. He said, at that point, I just thought it was too strange. I couldn't handle it. And he said to me, I want to know, would you like to learn how to manage your life force this way too? I can help you to get there. And he said, I knew in that moment, I didn't want whatever help that he meant. It was just way too much. He said, and I can't prove anything to you. I can only tell you that from that moment on, I made it my point to stay as far away from him as I could. He said, the only other thing I want to say is that one day I walked into his tent to ask him something because I had to as an organizer, and he had his shirt off. And this is what he said. I once saw him shirtless, crouched, organizing stuff in his tent, and the muscles on his back formed the shape of a winged dragon. It was incredible to me. And then he said, I never said anything until a few days later, a girl walked in and she saw it too, and she began to freak out. And then I knew it wasn't just me. I thought that was a really interesting story,
to say the least.
If you're one of those creatures, you don't get married as a rule. I mean, they don't seem to anyway, and have a regular life. You're transient. You move among transient groups of people, because then nobody notices you, and you don't make too many connects that make people start thinking about you. 4 months is a long time for something like that to be living among a whole group of people. And they were beginning to notice things that were wrong with him. And this guy believes that that's what he saw. that this guy was a vampire. The teeth thing obviously freaked him out. And then when he walked into the tent, that kind of sealed the deal for him. So the next story came from a gentleman who this actually happened to him as well. This would be mid 2000, like 20, so very, very recently. Okay. And he said that basically he was 15 years old when his mom met a guy, and they moved in together, and she moved to the country to live with him. He didn't really want to do it. He didn't like the guy. The guy was in full science, and basically, but he's kind of 15 years old. He can't do much about it. So he goes ahead and moves in there, and he goes to a small school. So there's only 30 or 40 kids in his class, and he makes friends with a couple of the boys that are a little older than him, because the kids his age are just immature as far as he's concerned. And he doesn't think a whole lot about it until he makes friends with a kid named Mike. Now, Mike he may be 17 years old at the time, because he's a couple years older. And he said, Mike would say things like, we have a group of kids that go out to this old abandoned church and hang out. Would you like to come out? And he said, finally, after a while, I thought that would be kind of cool. And then Mike said, we're vampires, the kids that I hang out with and me. And he's like, yeah, right, sure. Playing a little bit of fantasy there, aren't we, buddy? And he didn't believe him. But he's like, I was curious to have friends and to see what they did out there at this old abandoned church. So he sets up a date to go out there one evening, and he says out of nowhere, as he's walking up this little path toward the church, this old abandoned church, he said Mike just sort of melts out of the woods and comes up to him, and he's like, how did you find the place? Did you have any trouble? And he's like, no, not really. He gave me pretty good directions. And he's like, come on, up behind the church, there's a place I want you to see. There's another building. So he's like walking along, and he said, I see a couple people standing outside what looks like a barn behind the church. And he's like, I don't know where it came from. I don't know who put it there. It's an old barn. So maybe the church was part of a bigger property or something. And so I walks through the doors of the building, and all these people kind of funnel in behind him. There's at least 8 or 10 people now. And he said the barn was lit, and this is where it gets really insane. He said there, tied to this post, was the body of a woman. She was naked. Her head was cut off. She had obviously been there for some time. And Mike pressed a knife in my hand, and he said, if you're going to be one of us, you have to learn how to kill them. Let me show you how. And he forced him to stab this corpse over and over. And he said the other ones were all standing around, and he said they were looking at me intently, as if I didn't do what they told me to do, I might not walk out of there either. I might end up like her. So he did what he was supposed to do. And he said, as I began to stab the body, telling myself it's not really doing anything wrong, she's already dead, and knowing these are the people that killed her, he said it was like something came over me. And he said, I can't tell you what it was, but I remember thinking, I'm not going to make it out of here alive. And then I thought, I really don't need to be alive anymore, do I? Like a whisper in the back of my head. It's not going to make a difference. I'm still going to be fine. And he said, I don't remember how I left. All I remember is that when I got out of there, I thought, I'm never going to talk to these people ever again. And he made it a point not to. He said, except for one thing. I have a problem. I'm a grown-up man. I have regular life. But like something entered me in that barn when I took that knife. And I think about killing people. And I think about things I shouldn't think about. And I think about going back there because I know they're still back there. And I know they're still 17 years old. And I know they would know what they did to me that night. And that was a Reddit post. And he's very graphic about it when he describes it. And he basically says at the end, I don't care if you believe me or you don't believe me. I just know I'm not the same person I was before I walked in that barn. So I thought it was a really interesting story. And, all around the world, there are just so many of these vampire stories. Serbia, believe it or not, and the Ukraine are just filled with these stories. I'm going to tell a story from Serbia now. This is a legendary story in that area. It's from the Balkans, just to kind of give you a point of reference. And there are stories of vampires going all the way back to the Middle Ages. The story actually is a fairly famous one, and it happened in the 1700s, and it's really one of the quintessential stories of the Serbian vampire. And there are, believe it or not, there's multiple of these stories that have been passed down through history. The story is about a young man named Peter Bogdanovic. And there's different, like the last name changes if you go into the German to hear it told in German, but it's the same story. So this took place in the early 1700s, and it was in a little tiny village called Kosalava, and it's in the dark mountains of Serbia. Like I said, it's a little village at the time would have been filled with nothing but peasants. There was a fellow who lived there. He was not a remarkable man in any way. Nothing about him was remarkable. He was married. He had a family. He had a job. But Peter was, just a regular guy. And when he died young. He had an accident, and he died of head trauma. People didn't really think much of it. His family buried him, and they grieved him just like anybody would grieve a person. But things suddenly get really weird. After he passes away, a couple months go by, and people in the village start falling ill. They only live maybe 24, 48 hours after they get sick, and they die. And several of them confided to a family member that Peter, who was very well known in the village, had come to them the night that they took this ill. He had shown up in the middle of the night, stepped out of the shadows into in their bedroom or, wherever they were sleeping, and that he had attacked them and drank their blood, and that's what made them ill. And they sounded crazy. And at first people didn't believe him. And to be honest, it talks about the fact that nobody had any marks. So like if somebody had ripped your jugular open and drank your blood, there'd be marks.
You'd think.
And yeah, except for one thing, and I'll go back to that in a minute. So anyway, this is going on. His own wife comes forward and says, the night after he died, he had come to her and asked if she would let him drink her blood, and she had told him no. And 2 or 3 nights later, their son, she got up in the middle of the night, checked on their son, and he was dead. And she said, I believe he came in and he didn't tell his father no. So she's kind of got an axe to grind at this point. So the panic happens, and literally over a dozen people pass away this way.
Wow.
And that's a lot of people for a little village in the 1700s. That's a significant portion of that community. So
that
the
word
entire
would get around. Yeah.
Oh yeah. The whole community's in an uproar. People are talking. The peasants are ready to rise up, and the pastor of the local church, of course, hears about it, and he recognizes the panic, and he's like, we need to do something. So he says, he sends to the government, and he asks for help. They send him what's called, his name's Provisor Frumbald, and he's from the Austrian Empire, and he's to oversee this investigation. Okay. And a couple more people die while he's there, and he talks to this priest, and he says, what do you think we should do? And the priest said, I think we need to dig up this man and see if there's anything to it. He's been dead for 4 or 5 months. He should be decayed. So they decide to gather up a group of men and go do exactly that. They go to the cemetery. They have all the holy relics. They do perform the ceremonies that are necessary, and they dig this guy up. And doggone if he doesn't look like he just, laid down to go to sleep. They kill him again. I mean, they literally take a stake and stick into his heart. The story, the the report that Provisor Frombold writes is that copious amounts of blood were vomited out of his eyes, his ears, his nose, his mouth. And when they did this to him, then they cut his head off, the typical stuff you would hear in a vampire story. But then the priest said, our work is not done. Every person that died because of him, we need to dig up tonight.
Oh my.
That's what they do all night long. They ended up saying there were 17 people they dug up. Of the 17, 9 of them showed no signs of decay. And every one of those were then dealt with the same way. Now, what makes this interesting is that this is a truly documented testimony of a government official who oversaw the exhumation and subsequent re-killing of these people. And he conducted an official investigation. And this case the story of this case made it to all these newspapers. It actually is one of the cases that sparked the kind of vampire frenzy that went through Europe at one point. And it was not the only such case. Now, again, we're not talking about the internet time, so people aren't passing this information on, instantaneously. These were happening spontaneously in different places, and over the course of a year or two, people begin to realize it's a pattern. So there's another case. This is the first case I told you took place in 1725. This is a case that takes place in 1727, so not very far apart. The guy's name is Arnold, Pohl. And he is a Serbian soldier in the Austrian army, comes home after doing his time, and he told his family that while he had been in the military, that he had hunted down a revenant, meaning a spirit, a ghost, a dead person, something of that nature, and that he was to destroy it, and that he had managed to destroy it, but that it had bitten him while he was attempting to kill it. He went on about his life. He told this story to neighbors and friends over the course of time, and he lived for many years. And I thought it was really interesting. He said he was going to be okay. He told his family when he first got home, because he had taken the precaution to eat soil from the grave of the dead vampire.
Okay.
Which really sounds disgusting, but apparently it's one of the things you do if you don't want to be a vampire. I didn't even know that it happened. But anyway, he tells this stuff, and he tells them that it was an evil creature. And he said, I don't know how to explain it, but somehow I feel like this thing cursed me before it died. And he said, I'm going to die earlier than I would have otherwise. I know I am. I'm going to die in some way related to what happened to me. And one day he's on his farm, and he's working, and a wagon he's working on slips and damages him. He's badly injured, and he ends up laying there, at home for about a month, and eventually succumbs to his injuries. So he's buried. Nobody thought anything about it. He's buried in the cemetery. But a couple nights after his death, people began talking about something lurking in the graveyard. A man who comes out of the shadows, and they can't see him very good at first. He comes out at night, so it's hard to see him. But eventually somebody catches a good look at this thing, and it turns out that it looks like Arnold. Okay? And so people are talking about seeing this thing, about a dog that suddenly comes running out of the cemetery and chases them. And people start dying. They start saying that they're seeing this dog. And then people die that haven't had a chance to talk. Like, people literally just turn up dead. They're found laying there in the morning, drained of all their blood, and nobody knows what happened to them. And it doesn't take long for people to start thinking back to that story that Arnold had told. And, maybe because this all happened right after Arnold dies. So they go to the cemetery with the priest, and it's been now like 40 days since he had died. They dig him up. They find blood all over his face, his mouth. he had turned in his position as though he were laying, like sleeping. And they, again, turn the body over, stab it with a wooden stake, cut the head off, put the garlic in the mouth, all the stuff you would do in a vampire story. 4 of his victims were also dug up, treated similarly, and then they burned all the corpses. And there were 4 people who died from this, all 4 of them. And after they did that, nobody else died for the longest time until 1731. So a couple years go by. It starts again, but they already got rid of the corpse. They already got rid of the 4 people. What they will come to claim is that there was 2 people who had died early on that they thought had died of natural causes. And one of them, a young lady by the name of Stana, they dig her up because they're going back in their head to, who died around this time, what happened eventually. She was fresh looking, even though several years have gone by now. And so was the 16-year-old boy named Maljo. They had both been apparently been attacked. And the monk, a monk by the name of Antonio Calumet, actually participated in this investigation, kind of went through this whole thing, wrote documents that were then sent to his higher-ups and to the government, and they ended up having to do away with these other 2 corpses. Now, it is a fascinating story for that reason alone. In total, they would say that there were 40 bodies dug up between the 2 events. Over 19 of them were supposedly in a state of vampirism, were taken and destroyed the way I told you. And this was a mass exhumation of graves ordered by the regimental field surgeon Johann Flungask. This was sanctioned by the government, sanctioned by the church, and they had the church and this regimental field surgeon who monitored the entire event, and they signed off that this is what they actually saw happen. Quite a tale.
Yeah, you think after the second time they would just say, you know what, we're digging them all up.
Yep, we're done. We're all done now, people.
One and done. Yep.
So, I just thought some of these stories were fascinating. I don't know why we've never heard any of these stories before. Just really interesting tales of things that, that are just phenomenal. So the last story I wanted to share is actually from Puerto Rico, and it took place in 1975. So there is a story in Puerto Rico of something that roamed the island called the Mocha vampire. Now, the story is basically that there was a priest by the name of Joseph McCabe, and he was a Franciscan monk who had died in 1955. He had been talking about all these weird cases of anemia that were happening on the island. He was trying to figure out what was causing it, and people kind of put him off and said, there's lots of reasons for anemia. You can't use things like vampires and crap like this. This is not the Dark Ages. What's wrong with you, dude? So he passes away, and time goes on, and this is what happened. People in the village, in the area where he had been doing his research, started talking about seeing a winged monster that would swoop down on farm animals, killing them instantly and drinking their blood. And they describe it as part giant bird, part Mothman, and part pterodactyl. This thing didn't just pick up small animals. We're talking it picked up cattle. That's massive. Goats, horses. These are insanely large animals, and it could kill them. And then it would just drink their blood. It had huge claws, and they called it the Mocha vampire. And people were terrified of it, as well. I would be too if I saw something like that. It just went on for quite a long time. When it disappeared, this is interesting. Something called the chupacabra suddenly surfaced.
Okay.
And they're saying, is this some sort of bizarre, vampire creature that has spawned the chupacabra, which are also, by the way, bloodsuckers. Interesting stories, lots of questions, not so many answers. And I found multiple stories about people, contemporary people who, murdered and drank blood and seemed to have that compulsion or whatever. Now, a lot of those are passed off as mental health issues, and maybe very much rightly so. But some of them were crazy, where they managed to get kind of a cult following and people helped them, and it was just bizarre. So I don't know. I mean, and maybe the reason we're not hearing so many vampire stories is because we've decided to cover it up with psychology. I don't know. But I do know that I told you stories from, 2011 and what have you. People are still meeting some being that they're convinced is not human. And of course, there's probably people who've met them and had their blood sucked. Of course, they're not alive to tell the tale one way or the other. And with that, I will say that's my last story. Good night.